about politicizing intercultural language teaching and what it means, especially at tertiary level, I wanted to make a few points. Most modern foreign language teachers agree that their practice ought to include the teaching of culture from an intercultural perspective. That's a given. General agreement on what it means. Adding a dimension of reciprocity, and here I like using Cramsh's definition of it, which is very, very general but complete in my view. The IP is about adding a dimension of reciprocity, that's for inter, and social historical understanding, culture, to the notion of communicative competence. And third point, teachers have mitigated views on what the IP means in practice, including the political and ethical, I've added moral here, engagement, as called upon by scholars such as Barham, as early as 1988. Michael Barham was already talking about this dimension. Guillermet, Vico, and in France, and Cramsh in 2014. So in my presentation today, I want to focus on, firstly, teachers' mitigated views on the intercultural perspective, some of the key points, and that will be based on a chapter I've just written recently, which reviewed some key case studies on the topic of culture and intercultural competence as perceived from teachers. And here I'm citing a few case studies. Then I would like to go to politicizing intercultural language teaching. At tertiary level, there's very little done on ILT in general, and perhaps even less on the political dimension. I'm using intercultural language teaching, which is a label that my colleague Giolo Bianco and Tony Liederkot in Australia came up with quite a long time ago now, in the, when was it, in the late 90s. So that is referring to the intercultural perspective generally in foreign language and culture teaching. And then I'll move on to what I've called here applied political and ethical ILT, and giving you some insight into the review of the program at French Studies at RMIT University, which I've just joined recently. I was in Canberra before that at the Australian National University, but I've just recently moved to RMIT. So let's have a look firstly at what teachers are saying and basing my observation from those case studies that I've mentioned previously. So why do they have mitigated views on the intercultural perspective? And let's have a look at their rationale. The main points. Intercultural competence is not the sole responsibility of language teachers. That's something that comes up recently. And here I wanted to mention that in tertiary environments, there is very little connection made between ILT, when it exists consciously, and intercultural communication courses. For example, at RMIT University, we have intercultural communication, which is compulsory for all our first-year students in the main disciplines of my schools. Languages are one discipline, otherwise we've got international studies, criminal justice, social work, etc. So that's compulsory for all first-year students, 650 students. And what I wanted to say is, for the first time, intercultural communication, the course, has been given 2 languages. And it just happens that I've been asked to teach it. So we're going to be able to see how we can combine an intercultural perspective in a language program with intercultural communication. And I can't tell you how exciting it is. I've been waiting for 20 years to be able to do that. But we probably need to differentiate between the two. The intercultural perspective being more through the learning of a foreign language and culture within a foreign language program. And in an intercultural communication course, it's more about language and culture and the links between the two. So I'll leave it at that for now, but I just wanted to make that point. So understandably, language teachers, sure, it's not their only responsibility to teach about interculturality. Another point often made in those case studies I've reviewed, teachers would say, we've always done it. We've always taught culture, so what's different? Here, there's different ways of interpreting this kind of result. On the more negative side, negative, positive, depending on how we want to see it, it's certainly a challenge to professional identity to teach a foreign language from an intercultural perspective. So it's more than teaching culture, and it's more than the way we've always done it. As Claire Cramsh said it as early as 1993 with the first book, it's about being a different teacher. And you can guess that what I'm going to talk about regarding the political and ethical dimension of the IP has to do with being a different teacher. And another issue is unclarity on whose culture should be taught. And here I'll pause for a minute, and I'm going to quote Claire Cramsh, 2011, because she summarized very well the issue here on which culture should we be teaching. She says, which aspects of culture should be taught in a language class? Facts of geography and history, national symbols, small cultures or ways of life, norms of interaction and interpretation, attitudes and beliefs, myths and ideologies? That's one thing. Which kinds of culture? National, regional, professional culture, high culture or popular culture, mainstream or ethnic culture, civic or heritage culture? And that's not finished. And whose culture should be taught? The culture of a target country, of a heritage community, or the hybrid culture of multilingual individuals who straddle various national cultures? Finally, to what extent should also other semiotic system be taught, of which language is only one? So, and her answer to that in the rest of the chapter is it all depends on the context in which you teach your language. So I feel quite dizzy by reading that list, but it's one dilemma that we're trying to deal with in the context of the review of French studies at my university at present. And more on this a bit later. And another point made by teachers, perhaps a bit less, but still coming up, unclear on which and whose language should be taught. And in the context of French studies, for example, should we teach about educated written Parisian French, which was the view of some of my colleagues at my previous university, French slangs, plural, there are different kind of French slangs. Even a colleague recently said, why shouldn't we teach Algerian French? What about Francophone Frenchies? So French as it's spoken in Senegal, for example. Another point made by teachers is the researchers' unrealistic prescriptive discourse. So you might have read, for example, Marimba, I can see heads nodding, saying that others have said it, the ILT or the IP is very much a prescriptive discourse, like giving us how we should do it. I've written myself about that. And the big issue is what happens in practice and the gap between the prescriptive discourse, too often probably conceived by researchers who are not enough in the classroom. And I work with both colleagues who are researchers only, linguists or applied linguists, and some who are, like myself, both applied linguists and also language teachers, and teachers who are not researchers. So the teacher and researchers like myself are caught between the two, perhaps a good place to be. And finally, I've put it in red because that's my current interest right now, teachers' reluctance or unpreparedness to deal with controversial issues and real communication in the classroom, which is partly due to the fact that teachers are still largely trained to be, I call this like this, culturally salient. So like teaching French culture in a very essentialist way, for instance, and to be politically neutral. So, you know, the way we've been trained is you don't say that you actually are against the National Front in France, if you talk about French politics in the classroom. You remain neutral. And this is changing. If you listen to the last, I've cited Cramsch 2014, she's talking about being engaged politically, and she's talking about taking a clear position, engaging with students, with your opinions, and making sure, of course, that there's disagreement and there is confrontation, but done in an adult and academic way, and much needed at present. So you must be aware the whole debates about within education at the moment, especially tertiary education, that critical thinking has totally gone. I can see heads nodding again. And so how do we bring back content that is really stimulating and getting students to really think about their views and perhaps changing them. And the last point, the question of the level of political and ethical or moral engagement that the IP ought to involve. And here I'll argue that to an extent it is a personal choice. So when I tried to put things together for myself, I came up with this little spectrum here. If we look at language teachers' positioning on the IP in terms of the level of political engagement, one way of putting it is on that spectrum for low political ethical engagement to high political ethical engagement. And here we can place traditional cultural pedagogy, which is symbolized in the I am a language teacher. Often culture is not even worded very much, based on largely essentialist concept of culture, and it's still very much the majority view. Although many teachers do favor the intercultural language pedagogy, the theory of it, and some go as far as critical intercultural pedagogy. That's Guilherme's word. She talks about cultural politics and real engagement, political engagement. So I've put it on the more extreme end of the spectrum of political engagement. The ILP and the CIP is more based, of course, on postmodernist concept of culture. But here I'm saying it's the emerging paradigm, but I think it is also contested sometimes. Not everyone agrees that we should go that far. So if we're starting to talk about politics as part of intercultural language teaching, politics is about choice of society. It's about choice. And choice involves a personal choice. So now some words about politicizing ILT at tertiary level. And here I'm naming my colleague Adriana Diaz, who is actually here in the corner, because we started a project together. She's from Queensland University in Australia. And we're definitely very interested in looking at that political dimension. We're currently interviewing tertiary language teachers across Australia. But the main points here I want to make about politicizing ILT at tertiary level. So I'm not talking about primary and secondary level. It firstly requires an interest and some knowledge and some endorsement of the literature and theory on ILT. And that's not a given. Because at tertiary level, many lecturers don't have a background in applied linguistics, are not necessarily interested in language teaching and culture teaching as an area of research. Some are into literature studies, into cultural studies or other areas. So we're still a minority with that kind of interest. So in that sense, it is, for me, it is part of being political about it, just to put it on the agenda. And here I've just mentioned ILT is not mandatory at tertiary level. Intercultural language teaching is not mandatory. It is, I'm talking here about Australia, at secondary and primary level. Teachers have to, they are trained, and I'm still doing training for teachers myself, but it's mandatory for them. It's not for us. Yet, as I've said before, courses on intercultural communication are compulsory. So we're yet to find the connection between intercultural language teaching and these other courses like intercultural communication or maybe multicultural studies who exist also within universities. It requires a professional and individual choice. It requires an ongoing conscious engagement at institutional, discipline, and program levels to address colleagues' and students' often erroneous perception of what language teaching can be. So more than language skills includes culture and its associates. I've put here history and politics, critical thinking, an actual academic area within applied linguistics in its own right. We are constantly, I was going to say, fighting for that, or the fact that we articulated it that way to ourselves helps us to be patient and to realize that it's part of bringing the intercultural perspective in language teaching, that we have to change perception of what it is we want to do and what language teaching can be. And it's work every day. I could give many examples on that. It also requires a degree of institutional power to implement change. For example, I'm now head of French studies at RMIT University, and I'll be coordinating intercultural communication. So I can bring change because I've got that position. It requires long-term collaborative work. So if you're the only lecturer who is interested in implementing the intercultural perspective, it's going to be harder. At the moment, we are 3 out of 4 permanent lecturers in my program who happen to have a PhD which has dealt with cross-cultural pragmatic and conversation analysis and have an interest on how you apply this to language teaching. So we have the good conditions to try to bring in some changes. So to sum up this slide, politicizing ILT at tertiary level is highly context dependent for all the above reasons, and you'll see a bit more there. So now we come to the core of my argument. I don't know who is timing me. Oh, thank you. Can you let me know when I've got 5 minutes? Yeah, okay. So the review of the French Studies program, we started it really this year. Last year was my first year, so I had to see a bit what was going on. Our aim to implement a stronger and more systematic IP perspective in our program. So it's not that it didn't exist before. My colleague Kerry Mullen had already started, but we want to do more and in a more systematic way, with one clear educative, political, and ethical, moral, even philosophical agenda, I would say, and you'll see more what I mean in a minute. So we aim to engage students more, to reflect on the mechanics of meaning making when using culture and language. I'll give examples of that after. B, to reflect on personal and collective identity constructs, including the role of secular nationalism in the promotion of collective identity, the power dynamics between self and others through the use of language and culture. And thirdly, to reflect on human nature. We came up with this the other day. We thought deep down, that's what's motivating us. The nature of self. I've written about that, but other colleagues like Abdallah Pretsey and Porsche in France, as far back as the mid-90s, they had already said we need a stronger concept of self, a philosophical one, in education, including language teaching, especially with this intercultural perspective coming up stronger. And also, of course, relationship between self, others, and the world, and the notion that there is choice in deciding what kind of person one can be. That's really the motivation. Finally, we have an agenda, we don't hide it, to contribute to the development of intercultural sentiment, hybrid identity formation for a better vivre ensemble, to live together. That's a label that the French are using a lot in Australia and globally. So a clear agenda, potentially against current trends in societal and political movements in France. If I can make a parenthesis here, if we look at the current political landscape in France now, we see what I've called here Franco-French secular nationalist fantasies. So it's not the place to do a full analysis of the results of the regional election that just took place in December 2015, but it is clear that what I've got here is representing, by the way, only half of the opinions of only half of the voting French people. About 50% of the French didn't vote, which is quite common. But we've got here, so at least as public voices, we've got very much these nationalist fantasies, not only from the National Front, who gained 27% of the votes, but also the Republicans, so the traditional right-wing party, and also the Socialist Party here. So I've put here, of course, the National Front, clear, very essentialist views of what French culture should be. There's a small party here called Debout la France, France stand up. Les Républicains, obviously very essentialist and universalist. French culture should still lead the world in terms of the Republican principles, liberty, fraternity, and equality. And the Socialist Party, it's actually moving. It used to be a more multiculturalist perspective, but now not so much so. So the notable thing here is the absence of an interculturalist discourse. I have to move on. There's data that I'm starting to collect showing this a bit more in detail. Now, more on our changes in our program. So we offer French from French 1 to French 8 and then some advanced options. We've decided to leave the 2 beginners level for now, simply because we can't handle reviewing everything at once. And starting from French 3, which is post-beginners, moving on to the advanced level. Okay, I'm going to move to that because I only have 5 minutes. Yeah. So here is the way we decided to work. We have between 4 or 3 hours of contact hours between students. We decided to divide the hours, whatever they are, into 2 classes, Class A and Class B. Class A, it's closer to culture in context, in language. Class B is closer to culture in context. In Class A, what we've got, so remember we've got the staff, and that includes myself, who can teach from these perspectives here. We still have a grammar book as a reference book. We still need to teach grammar. And we do it as much as possible, introducing cross-cultural pragmatics and interactional norms. And here, the work we do is based on what I had done in 1996, where I had identified more clearly, for the purpose of language teaching, the links between language and culture. So, for example, we'll teach speech acts like thanking, differences between French and Anglo-Australian, and so on. And interactional norms, specific differences between French and Australian culture. So that works quite well, and this is quite new. As far as I know, at least in my university, but in Australia, it's still not common to do that from that post-beginners level. We include also, of course, work on registers as early as this French 3 level, discourse markers, and so on. And we introduce the French and Francophone world through the reading of some extracts from current affairs. Where in Class B, we have a theme. And that was the hardest thing to, not hard, but it took a while to come up with a common narrative for the Class B. That's something we could drive from the start to upper levels. And here I've spoken about, yes, constructs of identity. So we start with Astérix, and we look at Astérix and Le Gaulois. Astérix, the Gaul. And we start by discussing, so we look at extracts of the BD. We do the language work. We all know how this is time consuming, but we start dropping some seeds about this idea of the, what I've called before the secular nationalist perspective on French identity, and the Gauls, how les Gaulois, which is now part of the popular parlance, where it all comes from, when it came up, mainly in the 19th century, when the French Republic was being established and essentialist French culture took on full steam. We go on to French and Francophone biographies and memoir, the other France, and then Francophone and Francophone literature. So that's for Class B. In Class A, we continue, we increase. We have a problem that you probably have. Our students don't go systematically from French 1 to French 8. They can potentially come at all different levels. So we had to find a way of what I've called a cyclic cultural content, but still moving on for a more advanced level. And in French 7, just to show you, stop. Yeah, I have to stop. So, yeah, okay, I'll just stop. Can I just do concluding remarks? Because I actually started later. I don't know if you took this to account. Yeah, okay. Concluding remarks, more and new cultural content as first step of politicizing ILT at tertiary level, which requires extensive research. Finding a common narrative, of course, must be suited to educational context. Requires clear political ethical engagement. More work required on systematic ILT pedagogy. The emphasis here on systematic. It's not that we don't do it, but we would like to do it more systematically, and looking more closely at assessment. As we all know, assessment is the more question than answers, as Serco says. And then final word, we're also looking very keen to start collaborative work with faculties of education who deal with language and culture education, teachers training, to develop coherent content and progression from primary through secondary and tertiary levels. In Australia, it's just not done yet, but this is where we're moving. If you're interested in more, here is my email, and I look forward to feedback and to listen to the other presentation for this session. Thank you.